Welcome to the Nuclear Snail channel. Today we're going to talk about how much dirt and rust and grime and weathering your post-apocalyptic props and clothes need in order to look authentic. And this is a question that just keeps coming back. And I just saw it a couple of days ago in the newly founded Nuclear Snail community group, which is the first link in the video description. If you don't want to miss out on a great community group where you can get feedback, post your own works, discuss stuff, ask questions, basically everything about this topic of post-apocalyptic crafting, then go to the Nuclear Snail group. First link in the video description. We'll see you there, guys. Okay, so this question, as I've said, just keeps popping up. And it is a legit question because there are many arguments for and against distressing your gear a certain way. After watching this video, I hope you will be able to make an informed artistic decision about how much and what kind of grime and rust and all that to add to your kit. And we all have seen the extremes. On the one hand, you have the people who just never distress their stuff. This is partially due to laziness, but also partially due to the attitude that, in the apocalypse you would take care of your guns and your everything else. And on the other hand, we have the rust everything camp that will just drown everything in dirt and grunge and all that. And we have everything in between. So obviously it will depend which setting you're creating this for. A zombie apocalypse which has just happened will definitely need less of everything than a setting like the Genesis, which takes place I don't know how many thousand years after the apocalypse. So obviously it depends on the setting, but it also depends on many other factors. So let's go through a bunch of factors which determine the level of and the kind of weathering effects, and then we will be able to draw some conclusions. This video is, by the way, not a technique video. I will be talking more about if and what to do, not how to do the specific effects at hand. Let's begin with the point number one, realism. It is not the only thing you should keep in mind when designing a costume or a prop, but it is definitely one that comes first into minds of people when they talk or think about this stuff. Realistically, goes the argument, you would be taking care of your gear. That's why it would be brand new. So this is just half true. Yes, you would be trying to take a lot of care of your gear, especially of your weapons, of your guns, but this does not mean that it is an excuse to just leave everything completely brand new. And here is the reason why. First of all, let's assume you're in a zombie apocalypse, something that didn't happen that long ago. And let's say it has been happening for half a year or maybe 2 years, something like this. Now you have a gun, like this trusty M14 airsoft rifle I have here. Let's say you have a gun. And you have also probably some time to take some care of your gun because it's important. Will you be focusing on painting your wrist rail, or will you spend the low amount of time you have for maintenance to clean your barrel, to take care of your bolt, to make sure your magazines still fit and don't jam and all that? I think you will take care of the functionality. You will not care that much about how the gun looks on the outside. Yeah, it's scratched up, so what? Now, I know what some of you are gonna say. Like, yeah, but what if I'm in a group like the Saviors, and like Negan is taking care of all the guns, like he's cleaning them every night himself? Yes, something like this could actually happen, and this is actually a point for this theory. Like, yeah, there could realistically absolutely be a situation where your guns are getting regular care. Maybe you're like an elite warrior with a large group behind you, or maybe you just found new stuff in a bunker. I will get to this bunker point in a second. By that, I'm not saying that you should just say, oh yeah, this could happen, I found it in a bunker, and you just roll with it and not distress your gear. It's absolutely not the case. I will get to why after I've talked through the whole realism part. Because remember, realism is an important thing, but it's just one of the many things to consider. Also, from personal experience on many LARPs and festivals, I know how fast stuff deteriorates there, be it your clothes or your tools, including your weapons. A lot of people who have not been in the army or some third world countries or anything of the sort do not realize how fast gear deteriorates in field conditions. So even after a 2-year zombie apocalypse scenario, your gear would be severely beaten even if you're trying to take good care of it in the most cases. Again, unless you're one of those special cases who have access to bunker stuff or whatever. If we're talking about a scenario which is some hundreds of years after the apocalypse, you can bet your bottom that all the stuff there will be a lot more deteriorated than that. Because again, even some low fantasy, not a lot of time passed since the apocalypse scenario, will leave most of the gear severely beaten up. So what does that mean practically in terms of what kind of effects to add to your stuff? Well, for one, it's obviously makeshift repairs. You get some holes in your shirt and you stitch it up. Maybe there are some patches on it. There is obviously going to be dirt and grime and colors fading and all that. There is always going to be a basic layer of dust. However, dust is a thing which does not accumulate in spots which are exposed to constant rubbing. For example, take this sphere right here. Now this doesn't have a lot of dirtying up here. It just has a base layer of grunge. I will get to the base layer of grunge importance for any sort of prop also later in the video. Like, even if this spear, like, imagine it was rusty and like super post-apocalyptic and covered and everything, but someone would be still using it on a regular basis. All the spots where you rub with your hands, and also all the spots that go into the enemy and into the mutants that are trying to attack you and all that, all the corners and stuff, all the parts that you're trying to maintain, they would not be covered in dust and rust and all that. They would be actually polished and shiny. This is why whenever I finish my base coats of, dust and grime and all that, after that, I usually go with some steel wool or some sandpaper over the spots that are standing out, the corners, all that, and give them a buff, because they will be shiny, they will be polished. And that is not only the case for weapons, it is also the case for something like this shoulder pad right here. And actually, I've done a horrible job here, because all the dust would be actually accumulating in the crevices, right? While on the outside, it would be rubbing off all the time. Like, okay, granted, on this particular example, it doesn't really stand out as something that doesn't make sense all that much, because it kind of just looks like the leather has gotten some distressing here. But if we're talking like a really authentic dust effect, dust accumulates in the crevices, not on the spots which get a lot of rubbing and contact. Those spots are actually get a sheen, a buffing. So if I was to complete this jacket, it's not completely done yet, completely distressed, I would go with some beeswax or some leather wax or some other greasy substance. I sometimes take machine oil over all those seams and stuff that get naturally a lot of rubbing. So I have a quote on the topic from Alex, and I really had to laugh when I saw it in the Nuclear Snail community group. Here it goes. Rust some drinking can aluminum openers and some bottle caps, put them on your military gear, ta-da, post-apo. Rust your guns, post-apo. And don't forget bottle caps, rusted. And sew all edges, all of them. And bottle caps. Also sew the bottle caps. Welcome to Bottle Cap Nation. So this actually kind of sums up a lot of beginner costumes where people will mindlessly just add a buttload of rust and dust and grime and everything, as well as the really the most typical, easily accessible post-apocalyptic materials like bottle caps and can openers and all that, and also the classic sewing around the edge trick. Now, artistically, which is a point to which we will get later in the video, it absolutely makes sense. Bottle caps and aluminum can openers and rusting everything up, it kind of looks cool, yeah. It's legit, I'm not saying it's not legit, but just from the realism standpoint, it's crap. Like, aluminum doesn't rust and all that, and why would you cover yourself in all those bottle caps? Why would you sew around all the edges? You know, you will also a lot of times see people with like a buttload of patches all over their vest or whatever it may be. Again, artistically it looks great, But just from the realism standpoint, which I remind you again is just one of the lenses through which to look at your outfit, it doesn't make any sense. Doesn't, however, mean it's not legit. In that case, just the artistic part overpowers the realistic part, but just realistically, it still makes no sense. Now, the ones of you who are into guns might have seen this at the start of the video and be like, man, this is a G36, and it is a cheap G36 airsoft. But even the real G36 has a body made out of plastic. It doesn't rust. I also have another G36 with some metallic sheen on the plastic parts. Now, it is absolutely not realistic. You know, it is not realistic whatsoever. And this is my segue to the next point. While realism is important for determining how exactly your tear and wear effects might look a lot more authentic, a lot more believable, realism is, as I've said 5 times by now, to really have it sink into your skulls, realism is not the only point and often not the most important point when creating a post-apocalyptic costume. In Germany we have a saying, as Konsti has said, it's style over function, and as everyone else is saying it, and Konsti would never rust up a real gun if his life depended on it, but he still rusts and or at least grunges up all of his guns for the costumed events, be it LARP or festival or show or anything else. By that I'm not saying you have to add rust specifically or to your G36. If you want to be more realistic, you can not do the rust and do some other effect, which would be the equivalent of that. I don't know, plastic oxidation or whatever. But the point is, with your costume, you're telling a story. And everyone who's looking at your costume knows that you have made a costume. Like, you know, no one who is over 6 years old looks at your photo or your costume and believes it completely. They know you're telling a story in the back of their head, and your mission is to make that story as immersive as possible. So what is immersion in a story? It's something that makes them disregard their disbelief, at least for a moment. Something that allows them to sink into that world of yours that you're displaying with your costume and your props and experience that world to live it. And what you want to avoid as much as possible are interrupting factors that destroy immersion. And here is where we get to the black undistressed shirt that you found in a bunker. As we've established before, it is a situation that realistically could absolutely occur. And in the real apocalyptic scenario, all the costumes would be less costumes, actually not at all costumes, and just, you know, something functional. But in the moment that you're including this, the world is all post-apocalyptic, but my shirt is special and I found it in a bunker and that's why it's so completely clean and so on and so forth, you're doing multiple things. Number one, if that's your excuse, you're likely just being a lazy ass, because you have to ask yourself honestly, is not distressing this at all an informed artistic decision that contributes to my artwork telling a better story, or am I just being scared of learning the technique or lazy to do it, or just not understanding that it will just ruin my story, and it will ruin your story. I'm not saying by that you need to add tons of rust and all that to your stuff. Look, let's just take a look at this, and I think this might be something that you found in a bunker not all that long ago, or something for a low fantasy, not a lot of time passed since the apocalypse scenario. Now you see on this shield right here, like, first the overall impression is kind of new. It doesn't look like super distressed or like it has seen a lot of battle. It has seen some use and some battle. But you see that here are some scratches and some dust. And also the logo that I've added, it's scratched up a bit afterwards. So it doesn't look like I just slapped the logo on it. So it looks like, yes, at some point the logo was added and then there has been a bit of combat since. Like, this shield doesn't look like it has been through hell and back. It looks new. And it kind of fits the character right here. And I will talk about this costume further in another episode because it deserves an episode of its own. The photo is, by the way, by Freitag Photography. You will find the link in the video description as well. What I was saying is that if you want to display something freshly found in a bunker, it shouldn't be all that fresh. You know, there is a difference between immersive new item in that world, because again, even for completely realistic reasons, it would see some scratches at least. And beginners tend to underestimate the amount of them a lot. So a rule of thumb as a beginner, just distress your stuff more than you think you should until you get more advanced. As I was saying, there is a difference between something that is new but still immersive and something that is so new that it just looks lazy and out of place. This is the part I was trying to get to all the time. Sorry about the long build-up. You don't want any part of your costume to look out of place. And this, yeah, it's like just completely new because I found it in a bunker excuse, does exactly that. As Konsti also said, if everyone was using it, then everyone would not be going to post-apocalyptic conventions. They would go to stuff found in a bunker that looks completely new conventions. Like, do you want to see great costumes from other people? Or do you want to see from other people costumes that are found in a bunker? Just do what you would want from the others. You're doing it for a show. You're doing it to tell a story. And everyone knows you're telling a story, so make sure to tell a good story. Here is another example of costume found in a bunker. I went with this to Wasteland Weekend. From a realism standpoint, those of you who have been in the army or alike know that this size of backpack is something you would carry for a day mission, if not less. So this is by no means realistic from that perspective as well, or maybe the character has a large vehicle on which they rely. But it's definitely not like something that you would go on foot with wandering the wastelands for years and years. No, this is something that, you know, you go from your bunker on a mission, whether you want it or not, within a month you look like this. And in short, as far as storytelling goes, basic, or at least basic, grime and dirt are something that tell a story by themselves. It gives your costume a bit of a history. It is a shortcut or a shorthand for destroyed world, and using it, there is no shame or unoriginality in it. All the professional guys use it. We all do. And sometimes, occasionally, one of us will go like I did with this Legionnaire costume. Like, you know what, I'm gonna make a costume that looks relatively new. If we get back to our realism analysis, this costume, like someone who looks as clean as this, it does not even necessarily have to be post-apocalyptic. It can be just after a couple of months marching. It doesn't even look like it has seen any battle. Not necessarily, I mean, maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. But you know, it still tells a story, it's still legit. Whereas if I didn't add any base layer of dirt, it would just look like from a Halloween store. Or from a fashing store. Look at this spear. Like, you wouldn't say it's super destroyed, super apocalyptic, but you can still see that here are some basic dirt effects on it. And also there is some basic distressing. By the way, this has a light attached to it. Tactical spear. Actually, this entire spear doesn't make a lot of sense and it would fall apart in battle really quickly. It's tactical, or it's cool-thantic. Cool-thantic. Not authentic, but cool-thantic. But it still looks cool. I will talk about this as well in one of the next episodes when I talk about the rest of the Legionnaire costume. Anyway, this base layer of dirt and grime helps you achieve an effect where your costume still can look kind of new for the world you're displaying, but not look fake. And also another point is, and my friends who work on the 100 and Lost in Space can absolutely confirm, things look a lot less dirty on camera than they do in real life. So for those shows, they will overdo all the grunge and dirt and all that. And in real life, it will look overdone. But then on camera, it will look realistic. It will look authentic. Also, it is kind of important to establish which parts of your costume would get what amount and what kind of distressing. What Elliot advises doing is taking some chalk into your hands, and with chalked up hands, just handling your jacket or whatever it is you're distressing, just taking it on and off. So those spots would get a lot of wear and tear just from you touching them for a long amount of time. And those are the spots you distress. And I would go even further and say, imagine what else would you be doing. You would not only be taking it on and off, you would also be doing other stuff, crawling around in it. Your elbows get some distressing. Or like ramming a door with your shoulder. Your shoulders generally get a lot of distressing, as well as many other outstanding outside corners and spots. On your pants, the pant parts between your feet, as you walk, your feet rub against each other. Those would get a lot of distressing. And so on and so forth. Your knees, your fly, and your pockets, obviously. And there is even more to that. That is just like the basics. If you're playing some sort of a special character or portraying some sort of a special character, for example, a guy who has a very, very heavy gun whose belt goes on the left shoulder, and he holds the gun like this, and it hangs on the left shoulder, what would happen? Number one, there would be a lot of wear and tear. Number two, he might want to reinforce that part of his costume or his gear at some point. So, ideally, for a character like this, you would add some sort of a reinforcement to the part that gets a lot of rubbing, because improvising and improving your gear in an improvised fashion is something you would do in an apocalypse, and it just looks cool. And at the same time, it would get wear and tear. And at this point, you notice there is no actual value difference between the wear and tear there and the reinforcement that you're adding. Those are pretty much telling the same story. And that's when you're noticing that, hey, weathering and distressing is just a part of my storytelling. They are an important part of my storytelling, but they're also just one part. And that's the reason why just attaching a bunch of bottle caps all over your costume, it doesn't really tell that much story unless you do it in some specific fashion. But just, oh, here's a jacket, I'll just cover it with bottle caps and rust it up. That's such a basic, uninspired post-apocalyptic story that, like, come on. I'm not saying that bottle caps and can openers and all that cannot be used for telling nice stories. I'm just saying that your storytelling shouldn't be too primitive or lazy. It should be kind of inspired by realism, but also not too much, and so on and so forth. It's a really complex topic, but the takeaway point here is your grunge and dirt are a part of you telling a story, and telling a story is what you're doing with your costume, at least 99% of time. Unless you're doing something like a scientifically realistic simulation of the apocalypse, which has its own worth, obviously, but that's not what most people do. Especially not on Wasteland Weekend. Distress your shit. Which leads me to another point. I've talked about this in the past, but the Mojave will distress it for me, or the Malwinkel will distress it for me, or whatever the location of your LARP or festival is will distress it for me. Yes, they technically would, if you just stay there for like a year, living out in the wild while wearing the same kit all the time. I know people who live in the desert, completely off-grid. I'm talking about you, Spud, and Eris. So yeah, if you're a Spud and you wear the same pants every day, doing welding, doing heavy hauling, crawling around on the roof of your shed trying to repair it in winter conditions and all that, yeah, the Mojave will distress it for you. Otherwise, you really need to help the Mojave distress it. Otherwise, the story you're telling is one of in that case, Wasteland Weekend attendee. So unless you're Spud, the Mojave will distress it is not an excuse for you. You don't want to tell the story of a person who visits a festival. You want to draw people into your story by having as few interruptions as possible, as we have established before. So obviously personal taste plays at least some role in this. But as I also have said in the past, if you're going to a specific event, just give that event and its aesthetics a chance and just, do the thing, do the level of rust and dirt and everything else expected from you, at least stay within the framework. And some people tend to think that by defying the rules established by the organizers and the style guides, they're being special and creative and all that. Well, in reality, they're just destroying the atmosphere for everyone. What you should do if you want to be a creative rebel badass is stay within the framework that is allowed, but then still create something unique and your own. This is hard. This takes sometimes years of practice and a lot of creativity. What I'm thinking of right now is the lady on Wasteland Weekend with the raven dress. That was badass. That looked like fashion met Wasteland Weekend, and in a completely immersive fashion. It didn't have a lot of distressing to it, actually, but it was made out of typical post-apocalyptic materials and stuff. The overall shape of it was great, and looking at it, you would go like, yeah, like it might be cleaner than the average guy here or girl, but you know, in some high society place in the bunker, that's the kind of costume that they would be wearing. It's not the lazy kind of bunker, it's the, I really want to visit that bunker where she came from, where she can afford to look like this. Because the rust and dirt aside, her dress had some serious aesthetics and other departments going to it. Going hand in hand with this whole thing that distressing and all that, it's just a part of your story. You don't have to use it exclusively, you shouldn't use it exclusively, because it alone will not tell the story, but it's not a must, but in the 99% of cases it makes sense to integrate it to some degree. That is pretty much all I have to say about this topic, and I hope that it helps you to find your guideline as to how much weathering you should add and how much rust and dirt and all that. If this video was helpful, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It's the second link in the video description. And as a YouTuber of my size, I'm not making almost any money at all from YouTube itself. My channel lives from the support of my trusty patrons on Patreon. Also, as I mentioned before, the first link in the video description is the Nuclear Snail community group. So drop by, say hi, show your works, and I will see you in the next episode. Until then, hail the snail.